Hey, welcome to your first lecture for 1302, History of the United States after the Civil War. Okay, so I want to talk about three laws that were all signed in 1862 by Abraham Lincoln as president that is going to forever change how we do things in the United States, how we educate people, how we move around. It's even going to change how we tell the time. Okay, so the first one I want to talk about very quickly is called the Morrill Act. The Morrill Act creates universities that specialize in agriculture and mechanical sciences. In Texas, where I'm videoing this right now, that's going to create the University of Texas A&M, Agriculture and Mechanics. And what they're doing is they're trying to change, because universities in those days primarily taught either military science, they were military institutions like VMI, Virginia Military Institute, or they taught how to be a minister or how to be a lawyer. Well, the Civil War was a modern war with railroads and cannons and automatic weapons and submarines. And so this idea of having universities teach sciences, particularly technology, was going to forever change our system. So what Lincoln does with the Morrill Act is that land is given to the states to establish universities that are going to specialize in sciences, particularly agricultural science and what they called mechanical science at the time. All right, and that land could either be sold and the money used to build a university, or that land could be leased and again the rent used to support the university, or you could just build the university on the land. It doesn't really matter, it's your land. In Texas, A&M is a little bit of both. Some of the land was sold to support the university. The other part of the land was where the university itself sits. And so this is going to be a big thing. Sul Ross in Texas is also supported by this Morrill Act, although it comes around a little later, in about 100 years ago. And so this is also going to create a series of colleges that we now call historically black colleges, or HBCs, because our education system was segregated, but this provided a way for states, which were at that point primarily dominated by radical Republicans, that wanted to promote education for former slaves. So this gave them a place to be educated while still maintaining the segregation that was going to eventually become so incredibly oppressive in our country. All right. Another act that's going to be signed in 1862 is going to be the Transcontinental Railway Act, or the Pacific Railway Act. This is going to create a railroad. It's not actually going to build a railroad. What it's going to do is it's going to give land to companies that will build the railroad. Railroads are expensive. They take a lot of people to build. They take a lot of materials to build. They take a lot of time to build. And companies can't just drop down the equivalent of billions of dollars to take and build a railroad track from Chicago to San Francisco or Sacramento. And so what the government does is, hey, listen, for every mile of track that you lay east to west, we will give you the land north of that track and south of that track. And then you, as the railroad company, can sell that land. Now, here in Texas, there was the Texas and the Pacific Railway. Here in Texas, you're going to notice a weird pattern. All the towns in Texas, West Texas out here, are all 35 miles apart. Okay, and the reason for that is because every 35 miles, then what happens is you're given what's called a township. And a township is a 16 or 10 by 10 mile by 10 mile block. And again, you're giving it to the railway, and the railway could then auction off those lots. They could divide them up, and they would build towns there to support the railway. And that gives points for farmers to bring their goods, to load them on the railroad, and the railroad would take them back east where they could actually be sold, because nobody eats that much corn or that much grain. They have to sell it to somebody, and nobody eats that many cows. And so this is going to forever change. This is actually going to allow America to settle the West. Otherwise, like I said, cows. Okay, ranching. What are you going to do with this many cows? Nothing. You're going to sit around, walk around, and go, wow, that's a lot of cows. You can't do anything with them. You're there to sell them. Well, how are you going to get them to market? You're going to put them on a railway. And so without the railroads, everything else that we think about in the West, the farmers, the ranchers, the mining, the industry, all these things like this wouldn't happen. because there'd be no place to take the materials that they were growing or digging up, and also no way to get people from the west, from the east out to the west, and or goods, manufactured goods. You'd have to bring, like during the Oregon Trail, if you're going to Oregon in a wagon, you had to literally take everything that you owned in a wagon. Consequently, most people didn't do that. They weren't willing to give up that much in order to come to the west. Okay. And then the third act I want to talk about is the Homestead Act. Again, 1862, signed into law. What the Homestead Act does is it provides very cheap land for homesteaders. Homesteaders are people who go to these lands in the Great American Desert, Nebraska, Kansas, certain parts of Texas, Oklahoma, places like this, and they can purchase these lands for basically the price of a few pennies an acre. And this is going to do a lot of things. Like, for example, after the Civil War, there's going to be a community like Nicodemus, Kansas. Nicodemus, Kansas was organized by a group of ex-slaves from Kentucky that decided they didn't want to live where they used to be slaves, and so they all pooled their resources, moved to Kansas, and developed this community and they just took their homestead plots and they made them all abut one another, and they built this community. And that community is still there. It is the only what they called freedmen communities that is in fact still there. So the Homestead Act is going to make a big difference in people's lives. A lot of people who couldn't afford to go even to California or to Oregon on the Oregon Trail, or they're willing to give it a shot, and they're willing to go and form these little family farms. The most you could get, I think, was 160 acres, which is actually a pretty good chunk of land. An acre, just for reference for those of us who are not farmers, an acre is about the size of a football field. So imagine 160 football fields. You can do something with that. You can raise quite a few cows or plant or whatever. But again, without the railway, you're not going to be able to do anything. What are you going to do? You're going to raise a bunch of corn and go, yep, I got a bunch of corn, and I can't do anything with it. It's going to just eventually fall, and I can't make any money off of it, which means I can't buy anything. Well, between the Homestead Act and the Railway Act, this is going to change a lot of the ways that we do business in our country. For example, because railroads were so important, we needed some way to make sure the railways ran on time and that we knew when they were going to be going and leaving and coming. And so they invented time zones. And so you can actually, if you ever look at the clock and go, oh, look, like right now it's 8:45 here in La Mesa, Texas, but it's Central Standard Time, then you can look at it and go, that's because of the railway. The railroads, they needed to be able to have standardized times in order to function. And so you can say that the railroad invented our understanding of time, meaning the clock. Okay? Another thing that this does is that it changes how we do business. There were people who realized that because of railroads, you don't have to do business in your neighborhood. You can literally be doing business all across the country. And a couple guys that decided this very early on was one, his name was Sears, and the other one was named Roebuck. And they started by selling pocket watches to people on trains, and then they had something called the Sears and Roebuck catalog. And you would have these catalog people that would come to your town, or they would come out to your homestead, and they'd go, hey, listen, what do you want to buy? And then they'd use the telegraph, tap, 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 and then that would be put on a railway, and then you could come and pick it up at the railway station. And so you could buy entire houses from the Sears and Roebuck catalog. Imagine, Sears is going bankrupt because they have not adapted well to the modern economy. But the reality is kind of an irony because they created that modern economy. They created this idea of you don't go to a store and buy something off of a shelf. Instead, you order it from a catalog. Now we order it from the internet, and it's delivered to you. Well, that was not going to be possible without these laws that were passed in 1862. Now, lest we think this is all sunshine and roses, there is one thing for you to think about. Where's all this land coming from? We like to sometimes think that the United States, all this land was big and open and empty, but the reality is it wasn't. It was big and it was open, but it was not empty. It was occupied by dozens of American Indian groups, each with their own culture and language and religion. And they had a vibrant economy of themselves. They traded everything from abalone to Alabates flint to trade goods like hair pipes and beads and fur, and they traded with the Eastern Americans as well. There was a vibrant trade there, but their land was to our government more valuable than their trade goods or their goodwill. As a result of this, the United States, the United States Army, which had been battle hardened in the Civil War, is going to begin occupying, taking these lands and forcing the American Indians onto a reservation system. The territory that the American Indians can occupy is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller, and there's going to be conflict from this. In the days of the Mormon Trail or the Santa Fe Trail or the Oregon Trail, there really wasn't a lot of conflict with the American Indians because the settlers passed through. As long as they didn't stop, Indians didn't care. Keep going, fine. All right. Although there were a few that expressed concern, it seems like every day there's more and more people coming through, and I don't know what I'm going to do. Is this land going to be available for my children? But overall, there were very few conflicts. Contrast that with the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, and there is going to be a huge amount of conflict, of which these conflicts, despite an occasional victory for the American Indians, are going to overwhelmingly result in the destruction of their way of life. Their hunting grounds are going to be taken from them. Their language is going to be taught, is going to be, in some places, actually outlawed. And it's going to result in the reservation system that we have today. The poorest places in our country are the reservation system for the American Indians. Here's the one for you to think about. One of the largest reservations in the United States is the Navajo Reservation in New Mexico. And in that reservation, only about 50% of houses actually have indoor plumbing, and only about 70% of houses actually have electricity. This is 2020, and we're seeing that essentially these reservations are third world countries. All right, so in conclusion, these three laws, the Morrill Act, the Homestead Act, and the Pacific Railway Act, are going to forever change our country. In some ways, it's going to create the modern economy of you don't go to the store. It opens the door that we now call the internet with the global trade and just ordering things and then having them delivered to our homes. But also it's going to open the West for settlement by whites and by former slaves. It's going to and new immigrants arriving in our country, but it is also going to destroy some of what makes the West the West. And so, like everything else, it's two sides. So, all right, I'll talk to you again at some other point. Until then, have a great day.